Hey guys, this is Rudy coming at you from Palm Beach in Florida. For a minute there, I forgot where I was. I'm under the watchful eyes of the founding fathers of the United States. This dude over here is George Washington, and that one there is John Adams. What I want to do today is revisit the acquisition of Anadarko by Occidental Petroleum. Before I do that, I just wanted to remind you, I made a little note here. Remember that when you look at a balance sheet, the assets have to equal the liabilities plus the owner's equity, which is sometimes also called shareholders or share owners equity or stockholders equity. Basically, you have these three components. You have assets, and the assets should equal the liabilities of the company plus the owner's equity. That's the real simplicity of a balance sheet in its most basic form. So what I want to do now is I want to go into my internet browser here. And the first thing I want to share with you is that way back when I was much younger in 2013, I wrote a little book and published a paper on Amazon, which says M&A, which is mergers and acquisition as a corporate strategy for delivering shareholder value. Investor book one. My books are even more boring than my videos, so you might not want to buy this thing or read it. But anyway, it's actually just a short research paper on mergers and acquisitions. So when people say, hey, Mr. Oxy, what do you know about MMA? Then I can say, firstly, MMA is mixed martial arts. And secondly, when it comes to M&A, which is mergers and acquisitions, I literally wrote the book on M&A. Well, not quite, but I did publish a short case study on it. So I have a little bit of experience with this. And what I want to do is kind of just take you down a path here where you can see sort of what happened in the days preceding Anadarko, the acquisition of Anadarko, and then subsequent to that. So what happens is when an organization is filing a merger in this case, so a common stock merger or an acquisition, the issuer's name, Occidental Petroleum Corporation, files a report of organizational actions affecting the basis of securities with the IRS, and this form is called an 8937. And then the form itself basically says nothing. It just says, please see attached, see attached, see attached. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the see attached, and then we look at the attachment and we say, okay, what exactly is going on here? We can see that Occidental Petroleum acquired, so let's go over here, merged with and into Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, a Delaware corporation, Anadarko, with Anadarko continuing as the surviving entity and indirect wholly owned subsidiary of Occidental, the merger. Occidental described the material US, blah, 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 blah. So, okay, so this is the actual form that they filed. And then it says, as described above, pursuant to the merger agreement, merger subsidiary merged with and into Anadarko, with Anadarko continuing as a surviving entity, blah, 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 blah. Who actually acquired what? So Occidental Petroleum Corporation, Occidental, Baseball Merger Sub 1 Inc., a newly formed Delaware corporation and an indirect wholly owned subsidiary of Occidental, the merger subsidiary, merged with and into Anadarko Petroleum Corporation. So in the first place, what you have is a bit of layering here because it's not very obvious exactly who acquired whom. Although we can say Occidental acquired Anadarko, the actual legal entity is Baseball Merger Sub 1 Inc., a newly formed Delaware corporation. That was on August the 8th, 2019. That's just by way of a little background. So let me just get this picture off the screen here. So now, when we look at 2019, this is Occidental's website, by the way. In 2020, they sold some Colombian onshore operations, but we go to 2019, the acquisition of Anadarko Petroleum. The August 2019 acquisition of Anadarko Petroleum solidified Occidental's role as a global energy leader. The acquisition expanded and enhanced Occidental position as the #1 producer in the Permian Basin, and Occidental also became the #1 producer in the DJ Basin in Colorado and the #4 producer in the Gulf of Mexico, which is frequently on their filings referred to as GOM. The acquisition also included midstream partners, Western Midstream Partners, so WES, W-E-S, a growth-oriented Delaware master limited partnership with midstream assets in the Rocky Mountains, Pennsylvania, and Texas. In January 2020, Occidental announced the execution of several agreements to enable WES to operate as an independent midstream company. We know that today, Occidental still owns approximately 50% of WES because we saw that in their SEC filing that I shared with you in a previous video just the other day. So now what we want to do is we want to take a look at the actual company that they acquired. So this is Anadarko Petroleum's last financial statement, and that was basically for the year 2018. So you can see the date up here. Now, I visited with Anadarko once before as well. In fact, a couple of times in the Woodlands in Texas, which is just outside of Houston. It's a beautiful area, and they had an absolutely beautiful, stunning head office overlooking the Woodlands residential estate, which is really pretty. Nice place to hang out. Anyway, this is their last financial statement that they filed as of December 31st, 2018 for a full year. All right. So what we're going to do here is look at the assets. So they had some current assets, and they have non-current assets, which people frequently refer to as fixed assets. So you have current assets and you have fixed assets. The most common, the reason why it's called fixed assets is because it usually includes property, plant, and equipment, which are fixed assets because they're not really, generally not really movable unless they are trucks or vehicles or assets of that nature. The fact of the matter is, during this time, Anadarko had some current assets, about $4 billion worth. They had property, plant, and equipment of about $28 billion. So some intangible assets, and this is always a little bit of a gray area because you have things like goodwill in there at $5 billion. I'm not implying that goodwill doesn't have value. I'm just saying it's one of those kind of vague areas where you don't have an absolute clear value of what it actually is, because you can kind of fudge that number a little bit if you want to. And non-current assets, other non-current assets, I don't know what they are. It doesn't make any difference really. For total asset value of about $40 billion. So now you can say, okay, well, this company was acquired by Occidental Petroleum for $38 billion, and Anadarko at that point in time had approximately $40 billion in assets. So how much liabilities did they have? Because remember, on the balance sheet, the assets are equal to the liabilities plus the owner's interest. So the current liabilities are things that you need to pay, like rent and salaries and all that kind of stuff. So these are liabilities. You may have a pension plan, etc., interest payments, and so on. And then you have non-current liabilities, which is also frequently called long-term debt and other names. In other words, the same way you have current assets and fixed assets, you have current liabilities and then non-current liabilities, which includes debt. And Anadarko at that moment in time, at that point, at the end of 2018, had long-term debt obligations of about $15.5 billion. If you acquire the company, you also acquire the liabilities. So they had $40 billion in assets, and we can immediately knock off their debt. Their total liabilities, non-current and current, was about $30 billion. So now if you do the simple math here, you can say this is a $40 billion company. Those are the assets, remember, plus has to equal the liabilities plus the owner's equity. The liability is about 30. So it's $40 must equal $30 plus 10. And there's the other 10, which is stockholders' equity, right? So effectively, Occidental acquired a company called Anadarko, and the actual sort of shareholder value of the company was about $10 billion. Now, what we do sort of as a simple means of kind of calculating, you can say, I'm going to use a multiple of, and then that varies, right? So firstly, I'm going to say their revenue is around $13 billion. So let's say, for instance, I'm buying the company for 3 times its revenue. 13 times 3 is 39. Get where I'm going? Or you can say, what was the net profit? And then you can look at the income and loss here, and this is where it becomes a little bit gray, but you can say let's say, just to make it easy, let's say the net income was 1 billion. Then you could say if you acquired the company for 38 billion, you bought it at 38 times its annual net income. Or you can say I bought the company for 3 times its annual revenue. Or you can say I purchased the company for 3 times, almost 4 times the stockholders' equity. You get where I'm going? So there's certain multiples that you can use just to make the calculation quite simple. So for the sake of this discussion, I'm just going to say Occidental acquired Anadarko for 3 times revenue. 13 times 3 is $39 billion. So, it kind of gives you an easy number to work with. But these are things that you can keep in mind. The first thing I want you to remember is that Anadarko had assets valued at about $40 billion, according to their balance sheet, assuming it's all true and all correct. $40 billion worth of assets, remember? And then their sales, approximately $13 billion per year on an annualized basis. Let's just look another quick look once more at the asset line here. You can see it's fairly consistent at around $40 billion until they were acquired, but the assets was declining. The asset value was declining in value year over year. See, if we go back a few years here, in 2014, Anadarko had an asset value of 60. By the time they were acquired, had an asset value of 40. Okay. The fact of the matter is, Occidental purchased a company or acquired a company with $40 billion worth of assets. Remember that number. Now we go to Occidental. It's the same piece of paper, right? The only difference is I'm now going to compare 2019 to 2018, okay? Because we know when this transaction happened, and that's sort of our time frame that we're looking at. So this is Occidental's financials. Here we can see their current assets. You can see there's a big jump from 2018 to 2019, almost doubled. It was 9.9, now it's 18.6. Now let's have a look over here. Property, plant, and equipment. A year-over-year adjustment from 30 to 80. That's almost $50 billion just on property, plant, and equipment. So I just showed you on the previous slide, like a few pages ago, I said Occidental only made one acquisition in 2019. That was Anadarko. And their property, plant, and equipment moved from $31 billion to 80. In other words, they added $50 billion worth of property, plant, and equipment. Where did it come from? Because Anadarko, at the end of 2018, valued their property, plant, and equipment at only $30 billion. But here we have an uptick of $50 billion. Now you'll get some clarity or some daylight here in terms of why you have these impairment charges and write-downs of assets and things like that, because there's some very creative accounting that's happening over here to increase the property, plant, and equipment as a line item from 31 to 80. How about this? I just showed you on Anadarko's financials that Anadarko had a total asset value of approximately $40 billion. Yet Occidental had a total asset value at the end of 2018, this is their filing, of $43 billion. And the very next year, they ended that year with total assets of $109 billion, more than $60 billion more than the end of the previous year. And now we're down 20 as we go into the end of 2020. You get where I'm going? This is creative accounting at its best. So when you say, what is the actual value of the company? It's very tricky because you say, firstly, all the assets have to equal all the liabilities plus the shareholders' equity. Now, in the case of Occidental, if I go to the end of the year, 2019, that's where I am up here, right? Second column from the left. If I go to the end of the year in 2019, Occidental's asset value was $109 billion. Their total liabilities, $75 billion. Therefore, their stockholders' equity, $34 billion. You get the feeling that something is somewhat overvalued here or not, right? Does it make you think maybe the accountants know something that we don't know? How about this one? This is Occidental's income statement. And again, we're looking at it year over year. So in 2018, Occidental had revenue of $15 billion. In 2019, they had acquired Anadarko, and they had an uptick of about $5 billion year over year. And then for last year, 2020, they only reported revenue of $17.8 billion. So let's go back to 2018. Occidental had revenue for the year of $15.5 billion. What about Anadarko? Anadarko, for that same year, this is 2018, scroll down here to the bottom, we go to the income statement, and we say Anadarko had revenue of about $13 billion. $13 billion plus $15 billion is close to $30 billion, but jointly the two companies generated around $20 billion, except you have a bit of a window here that creates a gap because up until August of 2019, Anadarko was an independent business. So therefore, I need to assume that Anadarko's revenue had almost fallen off a cliff down to, what could it be? Sort of $4 or $5 billion on an annualized basis, because Occidental's uptick, which included for the last quarter, so September, October, November, December, anyway, since the acquisition was executed and completed in August of 2019, Occidental would have included 1/4 or a quarter of Anadarko's annual revenue. So let's just say it's 12 divided by 4 is 3 billion. Then you can say, okay, there's 3 billion, it went up from 15.5 to 20.3. So, $4-5 billion, whatever the case might be, maybe that's the uptick there. And then we see the drop off, of course, in 2020. But you see, it makes very, very interesting reading when you look at these actual financial statements. And that's really what I wanted to share with you today. It's like sort of when we look back at Anadarko, and many people ask questions all the time, and they say, did Occidental overpay for Anadarko? Well, overpay based on what? As a general rule, the liabilities are relatively easy to account for. And just by way of an example, if Berkshire Hathaway is kind enough to extend a facility to me or lend me $10 billion, my book entry is $10 billion. If I now go and buy myself some Maseratis with my $10 billion, then you can say, what is the value of the cars? If I say the Maseratis are worth $300,000 each, then you could start getting a little bit creative there, because you can say, okay, it was $300 when you saw it on the dealer's lot, but as soon as you drove it off the lot, it was worth $200,000. In fact, if it's a Maserati and you drive it off the lot, it's probably worth $50,000 if you bought it for $300. You get where I'm going? There's some vague play that you can make in terms of what the asset is actually worth. And then, of course, you can write off depreciation as and when the IRS allows you to do it, as long as you do it consistently. So as long as you basically say, I'm using straight line depreciation, and I use this calculation, and I use it year over year over year, and you say the Maserati, which I purchased for $300,000, is now worth $50,000, and you write off $250,000, it's okay, as long as you always use the same straight line depreciation calculation. So in essence, guys, what I wanted to share with you is, people say, was Anadarko a good deal? Did they pay too much for it? Did Anadarko have too much debt? And then Oxy acquired the debt, which is almost like a fixed number, but they acquired the assets, which are kind of like a little bit maybe fudged, So those things come into play, and then at the end of the day, you got to look at the data that's historical and say, did it make sense or did it not make sense? I think Anadarko, the acquisition, would have been a great deal for Occidental, all things being equal. In other words, if we didn't have this COVID pandemic, kick in, we didn't see the energy market tank in terms of the prices per barrel on a per barrel basis, it would have been okay, and Vicky Hollop would have looked like a superstar. And in case you think that is not true, I need to remind you that Chevron had bid $33 billion for Anadarko, and Occidental acquired Anadarko for literally only $5 billion more than that. So there's not a huge delta between what Occidental acquired the company for and what um, Chevron had been prepared to pay for Anadarko. In addition to that, Warren Buffett is on record as saying that the deal to extend $10 billion worth of credit to Occidental was almost like a no-brainer and a deal that they concluded and reached an agreement on, Warren Buffett and Vicky Hollip, within about an hour or so. So there were not too many worries at the time of the acquisition. What I did in this video is just showed you that there's some gray areas where you can kind of manipulate or fudge numbers a little bit to suit yourself or not. Most of the time, these things are for tax purposes and have very little to do with the actual business in terms of generating, in the case of Occidental Petroleum, more than 1.1 million barrels per day at a certain price. Okay, those things are kind of like almost predictable and fixed. It's the calculations that fall in between the revenue that they generate based on that production multiplied by the price that they're selling it for, and the earnings per share, which we always focus on as investors and go like, oh, that's terrible, or they underperformed, or whatever the case might be. So, guys, I'm telling you, it's not necessarily a bad deal, but it will take some time for this to filter through and for the assets to start generating good cash for Occidental as the price recovers and as they drill more, produce more, and so on. So, guys, this is a happy note. I'm just sharing information with you. It's Rudy for Best Investor saying take care and keep safe. Bye.